The prison cell was silent, except for the faint tripping of a rusted pipe that echoed like a metronome, counting down the remnants of a life once lived in gold. Allen Stanford sat on the edge of a thin mattress, his face illuminated by a sickly strip of fluorescent light. The man who once threw million-dollar parties in the Caribbean now stared at gray walls that closed in on him like a coffin. His hands, once accustomed to signing checks, shaking hands, holding crystal glasses, now trembled slightly as he laced and unlaced the same pair of worn shoes. Each movement carried the weight of memory. Each breath was a reminder that the empire he had built was not made of marble, but of dust. "Mr. Stanford," a guard called from the hallway, voice flat, almost bored. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His name had become synonymous with betrayal, with fraud, with the kind of greed that rots a man from within. His silence was an admission more powerful than any word. But once, Allen Stanford was not a man of silence. He was a man of spectacle. A man who spoke in numbers that ordinary people couldn't even comprehend. Billions, not millions. He crafted illusions so dazzling that bankers, politicians, celebrities, and entire nations bowed before him. His life was a stage, and he played the role of financial messiah with flawless precision until the curtain collapsed. The story begins far from this prison cell in Texas, the son of a car dealer, a boy who grew up under the hot southern sun, surrounded by the smell of grease, the clatter of tools, the steady hum of engines. Money was always part of the air he breathed. Money earned, money owed, money desired. But for Allen, ordinary wealth was never enough. He wasn't content to inherit. He wanted to dominate. He wanted to be not just rich, but untouchable. In the 1980s, when opportunities whispered to ambitious men, he found his playground. Offshore banking, Antigua, the Caribbean names that carried both the scent of paradise and the stench of secrecy. He built Stanford International Bank like an altar to himself, draped in marble floors, guarded by private jets, polished by charm. Customers walked through the doors, expecting safety. They left with certificates promising returns so generous, so steady, that doubt dissolved in the heat of his charisma. "Trust me," he would say, leaning in, voice low, eyes glittering with certainty. And they did. They always did. It was intoxicating to offer people the dream of safety while siphoning their trust into the abyss. To host cricket tournaments in Antigua, broadcast across the globe, with his name painted across uniforms and stadiums. To shake hands with presidents, to dine with power, to stand in the spotlight as if born for it. Allen Stanford transformed himself into a symbol of wealth and benevolence. But symbols are fragile. They shatter easily when touched by truth. Behind the polished glass walls of his empire, something rotten festered. Investments were not investments. Profits were not profits. Every return was a lie, borrowed from the pockets of new believers to pay the old. A Ponzi scheme dressed in the finery of respectability. Like Madoff, but with a Caribbean accent, with a tan, with an arrogance so brazen it bordered on divine. Still, the world wanted to believe, because belief is easier than doubt, because the promise of steady returns is sweeter than the bitterness of reality. And so Allen grew. He grew so large that he began to think himself invincible. Laws bent for him. Politicians smiled at him. Regulators turned their eyes away, blinded by his wealth, by his charm, by his reach. The bigger he became, the more untouchable he felt. But every empire built on lies has a crack. Every illusion has a seam. The year was 2008, the year markets collapsed like dominoes. Fear spread like fire. Investors, once content, began to whisper. Withdrawals trickled in. Doubt, that fragile but deadly seed, began to bloom. And in Allen's empire, doubt was poison. The first real fracture came not from a journalist or a regulator. but from the sound of doors knocking harder than usual. Investigators, the SEAC, men with badges, with questions, with papers that could unravel a life. For years he had brushed them aside, convinced them, intimidated them. But this time was different. This time the numbers would not align. This time the mask slipped. Allen Stanford still remembers the night before the raid. He was in Houston, staring out the window of his skyscraper office, the city lights shimmering like the wealth he had once promised. His reflection stared back at him, expensive suit, golden cufflinks, a man sculpted by ambition. Yet behind his own eyes, he saw the boy from Texas, the son of a car dealer, terrified of being ordinary, terrified of being nothing. He poured himself a drink. The glass trembled in his hand. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of fear. And it was unbearable. The next morning, the world changed. FBI agents, federal charges, accusations so massive they crushed the air out of the room. $7 billion. That was the number. 7 billion stolen, misused, vanished. 7 billion that belonged to teachers, doctors, retirees, entire families. People who had trusted him with their futures. And now those futures were dust. Allen Stanford, you are under arrest. The words rang out like a death sentence. He tried to smile, to keep the mask, but the cameras were merciless. They captured the sweat on his forehead, the defiance in his eyes, the quiet panic beneath it all. For the first time, the world saw not a titan, but a man cornered. The trial was a theater of ruin. Prosecutors painted him as a predator, a man who devoured trust with a smile. Witnesses described the promises, the lies, the life savings erased. Every word was a knife, cutting away the illusion he had built brick by brick. And Allen sat there, silent, sometimes smirking, sometimes glaring, but inside, breaking. Because he knew the empire was gone. The name Stanford, once spoken with awe, now dripped with venom. Prison was inevitable. 110 years. A number so vast it mocked him. A lifetime stretched into eternity. No mansion, no jet, no marble floor could soften the sound of that gavel. His wealth, his allies, his reputation evaporated. The women who once clung to his arm disappeared. The politicians who once smiled at him denied him. The employees who once worshipped him turned away. He was alone. And now, in this cell, he replayed the echoes of his life like a broken reel. The roar of crowds at cricket matches. The clinking of glasses at Caribbean galas. The rustle of money counted behind closed doors. All of it blurred, faded, until only silence remained. Silence and the steady dripping of a rusted pipe. Allen leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. He wondered how it had come to this. Was it ambition? Was it greed? Or was it fear, the fear of being ordinary, of being unseen, of being forgotten? Perhaps the truth was that he had never been chasing wealth at all. Perhaps he had been chasing immortality, and in the pursuit of becoming a god, he had become a prisoner. Somewhere in the prison block, a voice laughed, a harsh, broken laugh that cut through the silence like glass. Allen opened his eyes. For a moment, he almost laughed too. Because in the end, wasn't this funny? The man who promised eternal security, now insecure in every breath. The man who promised certainty, now drowning in uncertainty. The man who promised paradise, now living in hell. But the cruelest part was not prison. The cruelest part was memory. Because memory doesn't fade with iron bars. Memory sharpens. Every face, every handshake, every promise unkept returned to him in the dark. And he knew, no matter how long the years stretched, those ghosts would never leave. And yet, a small part of him still whispered. A part that refused to die. A part that said, perhaps I could rebuild. Perhaps I could rise again. That part was his curse, because hope in a place like this was not salvation. Hope was a slow poison. He pressed his hands together, whispering something only he could hear. Not a prayer, not an apology, just a confession to himself. I wanted to be more than a man, but I was never even half of one. The drip of the pipe echoed again, louder, closer, each drop a reminder that time had not stopped, that his punishment was not death, but the unending rhythm of existence. Drop, 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 drop. Allen Stanford closed his eyes. Outside, the world had moved on. But inside this cell, his story was just beginning. The cell smelled of iron and mildew, a mixture that never left his nostrils. Days blurred into nights, and nights into endless dawns. Prison was not only a punishment, it was a mirror. Every morning, when Allen stood in line for food, when he walked in the yard, when he heard the whispers of other inmates, he saw himself reflected. Not the billionaire, not the knight of Antigua, not the benefactor of cricket, but the fraud, the liar, the thief, the man who built castles in the air and watched them collapse in fire. The weight of 110 years pressed down on him like chains he could never break. Time, once his most obedient servant, had turned into his executioner. Every second ticked not toward freedom, but toward oblivion. He thought often of Antigua, of the bright Caribbean sun striking the sea like diamonds, of the stadiums where his name was carved into banners. He thought of how power had felt in his hands, warm and invincible. And now, when he closed his eyes, the only warmth he knew was the stale breath of the man in the next bunk, the only invincibility, the illusion he replayed in his mind. Stanford, one of the guards, once sneered, tossing him his meal tray. "You thought you were untouchable, huh?" Allen said nothing. He had learned silence. Silence was armor. Silence was survival. But inside, words roared like thunder. I was untouchable. I was, until you all decided otherwise. That was his truth. He still believed he was betrayed, hunted, singled out. He did not see himself as the villain, but as a man punished for daring too much. In the darkest corners of his mind, Allen Stanford was not guilty. He was a victim of envy, of politics, of a system that devoured its brightest. And yet, when the lights went out at night, when the prison fell into that heavy silence, the faces returned. The investors, the betrayed, the ruined lives. They came to him in dreams, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering the same word again and again. Thief, thief. He remembered one investor in particular, an old man with trembling hands, who had once told him, "My whole life savings are with you, Allen. I trust you more than my own family." Allen had smiled, poured him a glass of rum, clapped his shoulder, and said, "You've made the right choice, my friend." That night haunted him more than the trial, more than the sentence. Because in that old man's eyes there had been absolute trust, and Allen had devoured it. But the empire was not only numbers and money, it was theater. And Allen Stanford had loved the theater of it all. He thought of the 2020's broadcast in 2009, when he staged that surreal moment of generosity, handing out $20 bills to players, smiling like a benevolent king. He thought of how the cameras adored him, how the lights seemed always to find him, how his laugh could fill a room and silence doubt. Those were his real addictions, not the money, not the power, but the performance. He had been addicted to being watched, to being admired, to being larger than life. Without that, he was nothing. And prison stripped him naked of it all. The men around him, other prisoners, didn't care who he was. To them, he was just another fraudster, another con man who had played with people's lives and lost. Some respected him for the scale of his deception. 7 billion, man. One inmate once muttered with something like admiration, "That's some heavy shit." Others despised him, calling him a parasite, a coward hiding behind fake smiles. But none of it mattered. Respect in prison was not wealth, it was survival. And Allen knew that money couldn't buy survival here. He had to adapt. In the long hours of confinement, he thought of his father, the car dealer in Texas. He thought of how the smell of gasoline had clung to his father's clothes, how the sound of engines revving filled their days. His father had worked with hands, with sweat, with reality. Allen had worked with illusions. His father had sold cars. Allen had sold dreams. And dreams were a dangerous currency. They burned faster than paper. The trial had carved him open for the world to see. Prosecutors tore away his disguises. Witnesses stabbed holes into his lies. And the press feasted on his fall like vultures circling a carcass. He had once walked into rooms where everyone wanted to sit beside him. Now his name was spit from the lips of anchors with disgust. The next Madoff, the Caribbean con man, the fraud of the century. He had become a lesson, a warning, a ghost story parents told their children about greed. But Allen Stanford refused to see himself as ordinary. Even in prison, he searched for ways to distinguish himself. He wrote letters. He spoke of appeals. He clung to the idea that his empire had been real, that perhaps history would remember him differently. That one day, maybe decades from now, someone would write that Allen Stanford had been misunderstood. It was delusion, but it was the only oxygen he had left. There was a day when he received a newspaper clipping, smuggled into the prison. It showed Antigua, the island he had once treated like his personal kingdom. The cricket fields were empty, the stadiums decaying, weeds pushing through concrete. His empire's ruins mirrored his own body, wasting away. He stared at that clipping for hours, his fingers trembling, until finally he ripped it into pieces. He could not bear to see his kingdom turn to dust. At night, when the air grew colder and the walls pressed tighter, Allen whispered to himself. Fragments of old speeches, lines he had once told investors. Safe returns, trust me. The future is secure. He whispered them like prayers, like chants to ward off the silence. But the silence always answered back. Liar, liar. In the final months before his trial, when the empire had already begun to crumble, he remembered standing in front of a mirror. He had put on his finest suit, adjusted his tie, and tried to see himself as others had once seen him. Powerful, invincible, divine. But his eyes had betrayed him. His eyes had shown the cracks. That was the moment he had realized he was not untouchable. That realization had followed him like a shadow into this cell. Now, as years bled into one another, Allen Stanford was no longer the man of marble halls and champagne. He was the man of gray walls and rusted pipes. Yet still, he clung to a single thought. I mattered. I mattered once. It was not wealth he missed, nor freedom, but relevance. To be forgotten was the ultimate death. And in the silence of his cell, he feared he was already a ghost. Sometimes he would sit by the narrow window and watch the light shift across the concrete floor. The sun would move, slowly, deliberately, and Allen would imagine it was still shining on him in Antigua, on the matches, on the galas, on the beaches where he had walked like a king. But then the light would fade, swallowed by darkness, and he would remember where he was. The cell, the silence, the truth. Allen Stanford's fall was not just financial, it was spiritual. He had gambled not only with money, but with identity. He had tried to turn himself into a god, but gods do not bleed, gods do not rot, gods do not sit in prison cells counting drops of water. He was a man, only a man, and that truth was heavier than any sentence. And yet, even as he sat there, stripped of everything, Allen could not resist one last delusion. He told himself that outside these walls, people still whispered his name. That investors, broken and angry, still cursed him. That journalists still wrote about him. That in some way, he was still alive in the minds of others. Because even in ruin, Even in disgrace, Allen Stanford refused the one thing he feared above all else: being forgotten. The guard's keys rattled down the hallway. Footsteps echoed, metal clanged, voices shouted. Life went on, indifferent to his presence. Allen sat in the corner, staring into the darkness, his lips moving silently. Not apologies, not prayers, just fragments of memory, just echoes of a man who once wanted to be eternal. In the silence of that prison, with the dripping pipe marking the rhythm of time, Allen Stanford finally understood his curse. Not the sentence, not the cell, not even the disgrace. His curse was that he had lived his life chasing immortality, only to end up trapped in the endless eternity of regret. And somewhere deep inside him, in the part of his soul that still clung to illusions, he laughed. A hollow laugh, soft and broken, swallowed by the concrete walls. Because in the end, even destruction felt like recognition. And that, for Allen Stanford, was enough. The lights flickered once, and darkness swallowed the cell whole.